Hello, Mudis here.
Hi, Sai.
How are you, my
Good morning.
friend?
I'm
Oh,
doing great. How about you? How are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you so much. It's always a good day to be with you. I'll put it that way, to say the least. So I definitely appreciate the opportunity, my good friend.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you. Thank you, Sai.
Thank you. So we are together again, and we definitely want to welcome those here present with us at the current time, and likewise those who will be listening to the recording to the second episode of Deconstructed. And now we're focused on deliberate practice. So if you're a good mood, sir, I'll add a little bit more context, and we'll dive right in.
Absolutely. Yeah. Please kick it off. Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. So a little bit of background as Mudasir and I have talked, and you can definitely reference the first episode. We started to recognize there's opportunities to explore different concepts, different ideas, different elements in our world, especially nowadays, deconstruct them and really search for practical guidance and golden nuggets that will help us survive and thrive. And then really take different topics as we go. So with that said, Mudasir, I would love for you to introduce yourself to our audience with a little bit more depth of who you are, my good friend.
Sure, Sai. Thank you. And then going quick introduction. And I work as agile practitioner, where I coach and mentor teams and organizations. In that process, I collaborate across the levels uh, in an organization with my multiple perspectives, with the distributed teams as well across the geography locations to deliver the business solutions and outcomes. Pretty much that's a very short summary of what my introduction is. Over to you, Sai.
Thank you so much. And I would definitely mention Mudasir brings the unique aspects of critical thinking from our previous conversation and in practice, and likewise what we're going to get into today, deliberate practice. So very, very key reason why we chose these two topics. Mudasir demonstrates these in the real world. I'll say that way. So we'll go with that
Thank you.
additional sort of input. As I mentioned, I'm Sai. Essentially, I focus on transformation in particular. Love to partner with organizations in every way to really help them calibrate their business model and their operating model so that they can have, a deeper impact in the world. And at the core of that, very, very openly, is I really help them blend in many, many different ways, human nature, aspects of human nature, likewise, the reality with which they deal with, their own identity, and through awareness, achieve the greatest impact possible. So with all
Wonderful.
that, we'll dive right in, Mudasir.
Sure.
Excellent. Would you like to sort of contribute your perspective, or shall I, my good friend, to kick us off?
Yeah, this time we'll start with your perspective on deliberate practice and then we'll take from there.
Excellent. Excellent. So, so I know, and I think a lot of folks in our audience know, these skills, I'll say, are essential to really working with the world that we live in today, especially given the experiences of 2020 and that era, very openly. So they're essential in that way. And then really our ability to meaningfully engage the world versus superficially becomes extremely crucial in a very, very practical sense. So how we do this to me in deliberate practice, and again, you and I deriving this from the experiences we've had over the years. So this isn't theory that we're talking about. It's really about practicing and then reflecting on practice and then continuing to evolve that through reflection. So it's very much tied to starting with practice, reflection, and continuing to evolve it.
Right.
That's that's the core, if you will.
Very
It,
well said, Sai. Thank you for setting the stage. And then, just for my understanding and then, audiences grasp the difference between engaging meaningfully versus superficially. Can you elaborate that part, please?
Most definitely, and it actually drives us into the deeper aspects. If you will act at a superficial level, it's almost immediate. It's not internalizing. It's not growing. It's not learning. It's pretty much almost a reaction versus a response to the environment around us.
Is it fair to say that one is operating at the basic means,
Well,
very bare minimum level?
bare minimum. It's reactive. It's almost just respectfully social conditioning that we go through. I react to stimuli that's coming in versus being responsive to it. I'm actually now taking that stimulus and then understanding it, really applying my own personality and dimension to it before responding to what's happening. So very, very much deeper versus shallow.
Thank you. Thank you for elaborating and then explaining the difference between deeper and shallow. And going about this is why do we need deliberate practice? And then it's all about, and how can we bring deliberate practice day in day out in our daily lives, even at workplace or in our daily lives.
Excellent. So, so definitively a good set of questions to go after. If the world was simple, I'll put it that way, whatever simple might mean to us, meaning we can make decisions and take actions, and then really the consequences of those decisions and actions have, I'll say, a limited impact, more of a controlled situation, then we could simply be reactive. But in a world that is increasingly complex, especially given the experiences, as I mentioned, of 2020 and the different crises that manifested, at this point, we can no longer operate successfully without really taking on a perspective of deliberate practice. Very similar to critical thinking in that way. I'm gonna, if you're good, Mudasir, I'm gonna elaborate sort of three perspectives or three
Yeah,
elements
please. And this is
that
a
came in.
great sense of practical guidance that you are sharing here. Please feel free to elaborate.
Excellent. So Malcolm Gladwell, if you will, really popularize the concept, and everybody latched onto the 10,000 hour rule. So you do something for 10,000 hours, and that would be essentially the key to it. However, the concept of deliberate practice actually originated with Carl Erickson and his research in particular. And what he explored, and this is actually in a book called by the title of Peak in 2016, he said there are essentially three sort of types of practice. One is what he termed naive practice. The second one is purposeful practice. And the third one is deliberate practice. And he distinguished very much in the same vein that you asked your questions. If we look at naive practice, it's doing something repeatedly.
Right.
Okay. And as through that repetition, you're focused on improving. But the real thing is the doing. It's just repetition. That's sort of the naive aspect. The purposeful now, if you take it one step further, and then you really embrace the vantage point that I have something to fulfill, I have some potential to fulfill, then at that point, I'm purposefully moving toward fulfilling that potential. That's, if you will, purposeful at that point. In this way, you're fundamentally reactively improving to fulfill your potential. That's the second aspect of it.
Right.
And then the deliberate practice then, and this is the way that he deconstructed it, is at that point, not only am I trying to fulfill my potential, and my potential is fixed, as you can almost hear underlying what I'm saying, but rather I'm very much shaping my unfixed potential. I'm at this point now proactively improving to shape a future potential that I'm yet to discover. So it's very much being proactive versus reactive, from a deliberate to purposeful. And then naive is just doing. And if I can make a claim, Mudasir,
Right.
I think most people just do naive practice.
Correct. Yeah. And yeah, at times the purpose is not fixed, or they never internalize what the purpose is, and then how they can go to the next level of purposeful practice, and then reach to a deliberate practice. So, and then having said that, thank you, Sai, for bringing up Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour rule. And I have one fundamental question, and then let's say there is a master who has done all kinds of practices, and that master is out of practice now for a while. Okay, imagine the master is out of practice for a while, and can we still say that that person can easily equip after a while, and then still start as a deliberate practice? And then the underlying question is doing or practice is essential to master the deliberate practice?
That's a great question. From what I've encountered and working with people and myself, if you get out of practice, then fundamentally you have to get back into practice. So once you gain it, it doesn't mean you can't lose it. and
Exactly.
and you have to work at it. I mean, that's the crux of it. If you look at a professional, people say, well, I'm a professional. What's that really mean? Well, a professional is always in practice. If they come out
Mhm.
of it, they're no longer a professional and they have to rebuild into it. So
Yeah.
it humbles us as to what we learn, what we can't learn, and how we continue learning.
Good, good. Well said. And then once you gain it, you can't lose it. And even if you are not practicing, we need some sort of practice to regain it. And that's how I can summarize your response there. Great, great input, Sai. So what else do you have offer with respect to practical guidance? How one can start off with deliberate practice, or some of us are already in that journey, how can they master the deliberate practice?
So there's a few things that come to mind, and definitely would love your perspective on them. One is acknowledging, right? You have to have the fundamentals. You have to take the fundamentals and apply them with a degree of discipline and focus. So just to say I went to class doesn't mean you have the fundamentals. You've been exposed to something, but
Mm-hmm.
then actually having the discipline to take them and apply them towards some end game, some focused end game, that essentially is crucial. And that really begins now, I'll say, the journey. So that's one aspect.
Mm-hmm.
So I would challenge, I mean, as people encounter their day to day, have I truly respected the fundamentals? That's a fundamental question to ask ourselves every day. That would be just sort of a starting place to think about how you move
Exactly,
forward in every
exactly. And
practice.
then, if I may interrupt, asking the fundamental questions, knowing the fundamentals, and at the same time, challenge the fundamentals, and in such a way, given the context where one is in, challenge the fundamentals in such a way that they will get most out of it, or in terms of impact wise, and at the same time, don't ignore the fundamentals.
Yeah, yeah. That's a great point to bring up, Modus here. It's interesting because another thing that you're emphasizing really is if you find yourselves not respecting the fundamentals, you're potentially ignoring them. So
Correct.
catch yourself. That's
Mhm,
that's
mhm.
a that's a really good guidance, if you will. Um, the thought that comes to my mind as I hear you is it's a way to balance our ego and remain humble. Because if you ignore the fundamentals, you're yielding into ego, not remaining humble even to the fundamentals, which is the foundation for growth.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah. And then this specific point made me to ask this question. If a person is fully engaged in deliberate practice in whatever the profession they are in, is it fair to say that that person is going to achieve larger than life impact, or leave a legacy in whatever the area that person is? Is it a fair understanding out of that?
That's another excellent question. So to what legacy we leave is really an unknown. So
Mm-hmm.
if I say the next thing in terms of practical guidance, I would say we have to really identify what we think we can fulfill. So it's at this point now apply critical thinking to practice, just like we
Mm-hmm.
talked about critical thinking before. Because if you identify what you think you can fulfill, that gets you focused on something.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
one step is to identify what you think you can fulfill and move toward that. But then the next step is to begin to recognize and believe fundamentally that you have to exceed what you're focused on. Those two now give you the opportunity to create a legacy. But
Wow.
you have to get to the purposeful practice, which is the identification piece of targeting
Yeah,
something and fulfilling it
and
and delivering.
identifying that is will be a tipping point for everyone, including me, and then everyone, you. Naive, purposeful, and deliberate.
Yeah,
So identification of the purpose, aka goal, and then what they are achieving, or fully focused to achieve, will take them from naive all the way till deliberate. Yes, well
yeah.
said, Sai. Thank you.
Mauricio, there's one thing that comes to my mind as I'm listening to sort of our conversation. people will say, well, okay, it sounds so easy. Doesn't everybody just do this? Does everybody do this naturally?
It sounds okay. Let me put this way. It sounds very easy, but people are lazy.
Well said.
So
Very well said. Yes. Yes.
okay, so keeping that aside, but yeah, knowing the fundamentals, playing them, challenge them, and it goes to the shuhari, Japanese martial art. So in every trade, in every area, so know the fundamentals, bend them, break them, and at the same time, don't ignore them. That is very, very essential. Uh, Also, some practices, regardless of the context, regardless of the industry, those will applicable. And however, some practices, practices are highly contextual. One need to even a master of a deliberate practice needs to identify that nuance and then recognize the difference. What are those practices that is helping a person to have a more impact, and what are those nuances or differences one needs to identify based on the environment or context they are navigating or maneuvering. And this is also a personal practical experience I have faced in multiple environments, and in doing the same thing, but identifying differences and navigating based on the context, that gives you even much more impact.
Very well said, Mudasir. And I think you're emphasizing, especially to those that have joined us today, and likewise those that will listen, that it's not only the fundamentals, but it's the fundamentals in context. The fundamentals in context make a very different. It's very distinctive than just saying, "Well, I have the fundamentals."
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. And going back to your previous question, if this sounds so easy, why we cannot do that? And another point is the intentional application of the skills one has, the intentionality or deliberateness that doesn't come into play every time.
Yeah,
And someone might say, I can code in my sleep, or I can do something while I'm in sleep, which is great, but it may or may not be in naive or purposeful practice or deliberate practice. So one need to recognize, is it just a daily routine? Please don't mistake a regular daily routine to a deliberate practice.
yeah,
There is a huge difference between deliberate practice and daily routine. So one need to identify the difference between daily routine and deliberate practice, and then the way of working or the way of looking at whatever you are doing is going to be completely different.
yeah. You used the key word I honed in on, if you will, as I'm listening to you, Mudasir, and that word is master. It's it's a very very key word. We used the word professional a few minutes ago, and we used the word master. Um, it's interesting to me that if you really look at someone who's a professional or someone who's a master at their profession, they almost the true masters, they
Mhm.
almost never, if we can say never, acknowledge that they're a master. It's others who acknowledge they're a master, because once they acknowledge they're a master, then at that point they fall out of deliberate practice,
Yeah.
and they don't engage it in the same way. So if you never accept the fact that you are truly a master at something, you will always force yourself to continue to evolve toward deliberate practice.
Mhm. The continuity is essential, and
Yeah,
it's not a period, it's a comma, and it moves on, goes on. Yeah. And then
yeah,
yeah, well said, Sai. And then yeah, at the moment when we think we know, or we know pretty much everything, and then we don't explore, or we don't put ourselves in different contexts, different environments, then our deliberate practice will anyone's deliberate practice will become a daily routine.
well said, very well said. And put ourselves and expose ourselves to different forces, different environments. At that point we avoid the repetition. We begin
Correct.
to get the variety that moves us toward that deliberateness and deliberate practice. So very very powerful, my good friend, very powerful. So so let me ask you a question, if that's okay.
Sure,
Another
sure.
question that comes to mind. So there is in our interactions, if you will, over the years and kind of how we've met and what have you, for me, there's always been that spark in you, that spark that emphasizes, as I said in the beginning, the critical thinking from our previous conversation and the deliberate practice.
Mhm.
So if I ask the general question, and I realize it's going to be a very, very broad question, what feeds that spark? What feeds that flame for you?
Again, I feel I am I'm curious. In short, I'm curious that that helps me to understand, ask, clarify, verify what I'm seeing. So when that curiosity is met or satisfied, that's when the creativity kicks in. So okay, the way what we are doing is the way, and these are the constraints or these are the design, and that's how we are doing it, and curiosity will help me to understand why we are doing the way why we are doing, and then creativity kicks in once we understand why and then how it is happening correctly. Not necessarily we had to change, we had to transform. It can be the best solution or best ways of working that is out there, and just being curious and creative, having a creative approach on the scenario or situation that I am dealing in helped me a lot in my day in day out routine.
Very well said. So in many ways, and this is the continuity between our three sessions, the last session, this session, and the next session that we're going to have. In many ways, critical thinking, if you take that nugget of curiosity and creativity, aka critical thinking, and really put it in the context of practice, you get deliberate practice. And then if you
Well
blend
said.
the
Yeah.
two, yeah. And if you blend the two in our next session, we'll blend the two in such a way that really sort of maximizes what's possible.
Yeah. And 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 this is for me and you as well, and for everyone who is listening in, and deliberate practice will actually show you what a person is capable of in any field. So some people some people just assume or content enough, this is my ability and this is my extreme and this is what I can push for, or this is my limit. And limit is infinite. So in my view, limit is infinite. You need to explore multiple contexts, multiple environments, and you need to constantly, intentionally and deliberately get your fundamentals into play, and then with that deliberate practice eventually you will master, but that mastery is continuous learning. And yeah,
Very well
so
said.
yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, very well said. And it really
Maybe
truly,
I'm rambling, but
no, no, not at
that's
all. Not at all. Because it truly emphasizes the language that Erickson uses in describing the concepts. Because he says, right, he says about fulfilling what's fixed
right.
potential. And then he says shaping, if you will, unfixed potential. It's exactly that. And the way to do that is, one is identify, we apply that verbs, identify what is fixed. And then the next one is believing. If
Hmm.
and that's the, I'll say, especially in the profession that we commonly find ourselves as coaches in working with organizations, if people don't believe to pierce the veil, I'll say, or the line between purposeful versus deliberate, it's that belief that gets you across that line. And it doesn't mean everything you believe you can do,
Right.
but very critically, there is a line there.
Yes.
Can I throw one other thing out, if you don't mind, from a very, very practical perspective for
Sure, Sai.
folks?
Please go ahead.
As if you look at all the conversation that you and I are having here, and if there's one thing people that can take away, I would encourage them to do this. Whatever you're doing, if it's a
Mhm.
mental activity, if it's a physical activity, if it's a conceptual activity, whatever you're doing, when you get to the point of saying, I can't do anymore, that's the point to continue. Don't stop. When it hurts, that's the point to continue physically, if you will.
Mhm, mhm.
When you feel like you haven't solved it, that's the point to continue. And it doesn't mean just keep banging your head against the wall to find a solution. You may have to disconnect, but then come back to that point and continue. But that's the tipping point.
Right, right. And at the same time, that's a tipping point as well as a reflection point where uh, is my efforts going in right direction? Or if it is in my deliberate practice, is there any opportunity to change some of that where my impact will be more, where I don't stuck or that inflection point where I can continue in a growth trajectory.
Very well said. So it's not continue banging your head against the wall, but rather have the awareness to pause and say, is this really the wall that I need to deal with? And then
Mm-hmm.
at that point, be very deliberate in the decisions and actions you take next. Well said. Anything
Yeah.
else, my good friend? I'm sorry, forgive me. Please go on,
No,
Munisar.
I was about to say that not all fights are to be picked up.
Well said. Very well said. Very well said. Anything else, my good friend, that we want to explore a little bit with deliberate practice?
So how can people, and this is maybe a closing question, some or major part of our conversation will sounds very familiar, very easy, and then a lot of our peers in the industry might think they are doing it unknowingly or knowingly. How can how can they intentionally bring the deliberate practice into practice, and any one takeaway or one cheat code that you want to share to the audience, what is that?
That's a great question. I kind of tie it back to what we were just saying a minute ago. If you become aware of those points where you actually say I can't, or I there's no way to get past this point, and then you break through, if you will, then I would say you're aware of how you're exercising deliberate practice. Because if you're not aware of those points, you may be doing it and not know it. Most likely you're not doing it because of the energy it takes. But becoming aware of those points then becomes crucial. Ask yourself the questions that we've been asking of each other, you and I.
Right.
But that would be the
Yeah.
key for me.
And having a partner in this journey where though you are mastering the deliberate practice, it is a continuous cycle of learn, unlearn, and relearn.
Yeah,
So even in the same context, not necessarily what has been helped to gain more impact might not help 2 months down the line. So
exactly.
context is a variable at the same time, and then it has a time bound there, and it does not infinite in the same context as well.
Yeah, very well said. And you're actually emphasizing another key thing I think that's very crucial that perhaps we haven't talked enough about, but Erickson emphasizes this keenly is he says when you go from purposeful practice to deliberate practice, you need to find someone who is like a master, someone who can truly guide, if you will. That's a very key distinction. Find, you and I have touched upon it definitively, but he dives in deeply. And if you don't find someone, then it creates its own challenges. So it's a very, very interesting way to approach that challenge, I'll say.
Yes, yes, very true. Yeah, and it is not going to be a journey if you are alone in that, and then you will one will struggle a lot, and yeah, a partner will always help,
Well said. Well said.
if not at least to see the blind spots.
Most definitely. And if it, as we all have difficulty finding good partners, if you find a good partner, don't lose the partner. Put it that way. But one technique that very practically I recommend to folks is the partner that you find doesn't always have to be a person. It can be a book, that can be a companion for a portion of the journey. And and I'll mention two books if that's okay. We've already mentioned one, but I'll mention another one if that's all right. That really ties into this discussion. Peak is one by Erickson. I highly recommend that one. The other one, which is very, very, and I know you and I have talked about it before, is Mastery by Robert Greene. Mastery is another key book that I would encourage folks to take a look at that offers very definitive perspective on deliberate practice.
Thank you,
So
Sai. Thanks for your inputs on the good reads related to deliberate practice, and anything else that we want to explore or discuss further.
I think we are good, and I think we've really set the stage from the previous conversation to this conversation to our next conversation, where we blend critical thinking and deliberate practice in a deconstructed way.
Well said, Sai. Yeah, and then yeah, stay tuned for our series of conversations to the audience, and then we're gonna discuss multiple topics coming up, and then it's gonna be exciting journey for including me, both of us, and the people who are following us.
Most definitely, most definitely. And if folks want to join us in some way, or reach out, or have a specific topic that you'd like to explore, I'd like us to explore, do reach out. And until next time, thank you,
Thank you,
Mudasir, and
Sai.
thank you so
Thank
much,
you
my good
all.
friend. Thank you all.
Bye.
Take care now.